Hi, I'm EXO, and this video is a doozy. I'm going to talk about the challenges that we are currently dealing with when it comes to the idea of getting out a project that emulates and captures the full breadth of Windows 95 and Windows 98, something that we refer to as the Win9x project. For those who have been following my projects, you are aware that I have EXO-DOS, which has MS-DOS in it. I have EXO Win3x, which is all Windows 3.30 to 3.1. I have EXO Apple IIgs. I have EXO Apple IIe on the way, not out yet. And we also have EXO Scum VM. Each of these projects that are currently out, the goal, the scope, if you will, of them is to represent the full width and breadth of gaming for that console. Now, the Win3x console, OS, GUI, depending what you want to call it, that one is unique in that the multimedia aspect of it led to a lot of things that are not games being released for it. You had recipe managers, you had encyclopedias, any excuse they could find to put out a disc that they could sell you for 30, 40, 50 bucks, they did. Now, because so much of that is defined by that era, we have added that. So the scope is a little bit larger when it comes to Win3x. 9x. Alright, so first of all, there's, I think, 14 to 20,000 some odd games that are known. And I'm guessing there's probably another 10,000 that aren't. Somewhere between 20 to 30,000 titles is my guess as to the size of a 9x project. Now, from a commercial standpoint, which would be priority one, not nearly that number. Probably 6 or 7,000 commercial titles for those two systems. Maybe 8, less than 10 though. It's really when you get into all the things that were made with like processes like click and play, other little homebrew things, all the little widget type games like, I mean, Minesweeper shipped with Windows or came with Windows, but things like Minesweeper that people made that you could just download and just run in a window, did not require installation. There's a lot of that stuff too for the era. That would be a second priority, not a first. But let's hypothetically say, for the sake of easy math, that there were 10,000 titles we would want to get into the original version 1 9x commercial. The two biggest challenges right now, one is a full speed emulator that works, that's stable. From an emulator standpoint, you can run x86 box, PCEM, or DOSBox. Within DOSBox, you can set up a virtual hard drive, you can install DOS to it, you can then overlay 95 or 98 on top of that, and you can run Windows 95 or 98 in DOSBox. With something like PCEM or x86 box, you pick the BIOS for the machine that you're trying to run. You make a hard drive image that's blank. You install the disk images to it all through the emulator, and in that case, your PCM differs from DOSBox, and that DOSBox is emulating the machine hardware, and then after that, it's trying to lay on its version of what the DOS OS was, which most people do not realize is it reports its version as 5.0. If you play a game that expects DOS 6, it will tell you that your DOS is not new enough in DOSBox, so you have to use the ver command, VER, and then set that to like 6 or 6.22 or whatever, and that will fool the game into thinking you have the proper version of DOSBox or DOS it wants. The challenge with these solutions, and I guess before I get into those challenges, I should explain why I'm only talking about those solutions. There are other options. There's VMware, ThinApp, OTVDM. These all have their own challenges, and the reason I don't consider them viable whatsoever for my project is, for a project to be an EXO project, it has to be playable and usable. It needs to be portable. If the end user has to install VMware on their machine and then go and grab the disk images, the VMs that we've made, and load them, and then that boots into Windows, and they have to go start the game. That's not playability. I might as well at that point literally just release a giant pack of images of every game and say, figure it out yourself. But that's not preservation. Not the way I do it. I think there is a value to having the original disc out there floating around, which is why every time I can find an original disc, whether that be floppy or CD, I include it in the folder with the game files in Exodus and Win9x. For me, the true preservation, and I've talked about this at length in other videos, is giving someone the ability to double-click on a file. It launches, it starts. You don't have to know DOS. You don't have to understand how to install Windows 95. You don't have to understand how to navigate Windows 95 and mount the right CD drive and then go... There's things that those of us who've been doing emulation for a long time take for granted. And it creates a little bit of a gate-kept community where new people have a very steep learning curve to come into it. And my projects try to avoid that curve by completely skipping past the curve and saying, hey, it's ready to go. The people who have the most problems with Exodus tend to be the people who are used to doing it all themselves. They download it, they either skip the setup file and they start trying to run the game, or they run setup and they start trying to tweak it themselves. And they often end up in the help channel asking what went wrong. And what went wrong is they tried to do it themselves. You don't need to do it yourself. It's all set up for you. And that would be the goal with a 9x project. At least one that has the XO name on it. So, we're talking about a DOSBox, Fork, PCEM, or x86. All three of them have speed issues and stability issues. They work. You can get Windows running in them. But then you load up, like, I remember testing Resident Evil Director's Cut. And it ran slow as crap on DOSBox. It was really janky on PCEM. And there was some graphical, at the time, this was about 2 years ago, some graphical issue elements with x86 box. For those who don't know, x86 box is a spinoff of PCEM. There are pros and cons to both of them. I'm not here to pick a fight with anybody or say one's worse than the other. I will simply say that neither of them are stable enough to be considered an all-inclusive solution for every game released for Windows 95 and Windows 98. And if anyone can't agree on that, then they haven't used the software enough. I can name off 10 titles without thinking too hard that you cannot get running in these software at all. It gets even more confusing and difficult when you start getting to games that had 3D acceleration card support. Anyway, I digress. Stability, speed. They have to be playable. It doesn't make sense to spend years of my life setting up 10,000 games and they don't run very well. They don't play full speed. They crash. They bug out. They jitter. It's pointless to set them up that way. It needs to be done right. Now, the second challenge is the one that is more pressing in terms of I can't even begin the process without these tools in place. And that is, let's do some basic math here. First, every game has to have its own copy of Windows. You cannot install more than 10 some odd games to a single copy of Windows. And even if you did that, alright, so first of all, why can't you do that? Different games want different color depths, they want different resolutions, they have different third-party software requirements, like this game wants QuickTime 3.1 and this one wants 2.1. And they are not compatible with each other. 3.1 does not play the 2.1 game. Not always. Not often. In Windows 3X, oh my gosh, it was a nightmare. When I first started that project, I got 2 games deep, and the second game broke the first game. Windows 95 and 3.1 specifically were the Wild West. Games did not always write their files to the folder you installed them to. They would put files on your C drive, in the root folder. They would write files directly to your Windows folder, your system folder. So you start installing more than a handful of games to the system, and you are always running a risk that you're going to damage one of the other games that you've already set up. So unless you want to go test, if you set up a game, you set up a second game, you got to go test the first game. You set up a third game, you got to go back and test the first game and the second game. You set up a fourth game, you got to go test the first, second, and third game. You can see how this gets out of hand pretty quick. Now, it's also really bad for preservation. Who wants to download a Windows image that has 10 games installed to it when you only wanted one of those games? Or you're only trying to preserve one of those games? That's like if someone took, TV shows and just took everything that came on from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. that day, made one giant video file out of it and said, okay, that's September 30th, 2023, it's been preserved. But you come along as someone that wants to appreciate that media, watch that media, use that media, and you only wanted what came on at noon. So you gotta go in there and you gotta download the whole day's worth, and then you gotta fast forward to get what you want to. In this case, you gotta download an entire. It doesn't make sense. It's not good for preservation. It's not good for cleanliness of running everything. It's not good for testing and regressions. Windows, for people who say, well, I used to have 30 games installed back in the day. Yeah, and do you remember how many times your Windows blue screened on you? Do you remember how many times you had to reinstall Windows 95 or 98 from scratch? A lot of it was like a monthly ritual. Maybe it was a quarterly ritual. If you were lucky, it was only twice a year. But in general, if you did not reinstall Windows, you had programs that didn't work, you had crashes all the time, you had memory leaks, you had all kinds of problems. That's not the type of preservation I'm looking to preserve here. I'm not trying to preserve the negatives. Same like in Exodus, you don't have to go in and play with the your memory manager. You don't have to try to free up 512 KB out of your 640 so that your mouse driver and your CD-ROM driver can both load while you get the game running. We haven't emulated that. We have not preserved that for you. There's no fun in it, I promise you. If you have nostalgia for it, go do it. And within 5 minutes, you'll say, damn, I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. So, bear with me. Let's make the assumption we have 10,000 games. And every game has to have a clean install of Windows for us to trust that it works properly at full speed. Okay? A medium install of Windows 98 is about 200 megabytes. Now, I've heard all these arguments a million times before, so I'm able to get ahead of you. Somebody out there just said, no, you can make it much smaller than that. Yes, you can. You can get it down to like 80 megabytes. I've seen it as low as 50 if you really strip the crap out of it. The problem with these stripped down slim installs are, A, you don't know which components the game might need until you install the game, and it tells you, hey, why don't you have a network card installed or a driver for it? And yes, there are games that want that before they'll even get going. It could be the Windows Media Player. Nope, I need that. I need the codecs from it. Why did you take it out? Plus, if you have to then turn around and install that stuff back into it, you're creating a scenario where you're creating a lot more work for yourself, right? Now, if you do the math on this, 200 megabytes per game, 10,000 games. That if you were to add all 10,000 games and they all had a 200 megabyte OS attached to them, that is 2 terabytes of duplicative OS data. If you can get it down to 80 megabytes in a slim install, you are still dealing with 800 gigabytes of duplicative OS data. That's a lot of space lost when it's mainly the same thing over and over and over. The solution for this is something called a parent-child image. QEMU supports this, I believe. And the idea of it is, you have 2 image files. One of them is the parent, and one of them is the child. And I bet I should be doing that backwards, because the camera's reversing me. So, let's say this guy's the parent over here. Right? You would load the parent up, install Windows 95 to it, make another parent, load Windows 98 to it, maybe make a third one and load Windows 98 SE to it. Then going forward, when you want to install a game to Windows 98, you load the parent, you load a child, the child marries the parent. Wait, that doesn't sound right at all. The child hangs out with the parent, and it reports itself as the C drive, the same way this is the C drive. But all diffs, all changes that take place, are installed to the child. So, any new files that didn't exist on the image before, child. Any changes to existing files that were on the parent, child. Now there is a bit of a performance hit here because it has to, in real time, say, oh, well, these 5 Windows files got modified, so I need to load them off the child, not off the parent. There's some swapping there, challenges. But if you do this, you only need to have the OS a handful of times. I listed off 3 case scenarios. I can see maybe like 2 or 3 more for weird one-off situations. And then the child, ideally, is only the size of the installed game and the changed files from the parent. Which brings up the second part of the storage. Most hard drive images have to be defined at the time they are created, and they take up that amount of size on the disk. Windows 98 can allocate up to 2 gigabytes for a mounted drive. Anything bigger than that, it can't allocate it, can't see it. Now, there are always exceptions. I'm sure some of you know ways to get around that. There's a special tool you could run, or you could, wiggle the dongle while stroking the mouse, and if you did that at the right time, it might like you. I'm not here to discuss all the potential weird little hacky ways. In general, out of the box, according to the manual, 2 gigabytes was the max hard drive size for Windows 98. I think it was even less for 95, but it may have been 2 gigabytes. Now, you don't need that for every game. But you don't know what you need for every game until you've installed the game. The game might be sitting on a CD that takes up 700 megabytes, but maybe the install only takes up 20 megabytes, and it runs primarily off the CD. Or maybe it copies everything off the CD, and so it takes up 700 megabytes. Or maybe it copies everything off the CD and then decompresses it, and it takes up a gigabyte. You don't know till you do it. And imagine having to install all 10,000 games twice. Once to find out how big it's going to be, then you scrub all that, and then you make that hard drive, you make it the right size, you load it up, you do it again, you configure it, you put it out there. So the math would always be, how much do I need on disk space? I install it, I leave another 50 to 100 megabytes available for save games, scratch space, etc., your virtual drive. And that's a long process. The much better way to go is dynamic image sizing. With that, you can tell a drive that it is 2 gigabytes. But if you only have a 1 megabyte file on that, it only takes up 1 megabyte on your disk. Well, 1 megabyte plus change with the header information, right? And as you write to that image, it expands dynamically. Instead of being a 2 gigabyte file that is 99.9% empty. That saves a ton of time, and it allows games to be updated. If we were to install a game, get it running perfectly, and it's got 50 megabytes of extra space for scratch space and save games, and then we come along later and find out, oh crap, there was a DLC disc that they released, an expansion disc. Or, more likely, the company put out this free thing on their website in 2002, and it added a bunch of levels. But guess what? It's 75 megabytes. Crap! You'd have to reinstall the whole game, repack the whole thing, and next time I put an update out, you have to re-download it all from scratch, because we added more levels and there was enough space. If it's a dynamic drive, you can tell it it's 2 gigabytes. It'll only take up what you're using, and you can add that extra data to it, and it will just get big enough and take that data. So, recap. The 2 things from a technical perspective that must be in place for EXO Win9x to be a reality is A, parent-child images, and B, dynamic sizing images. Now, in a heartbreaking move, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, ever since COVID, time is a blur, sometime since COVID, there was a point, maybe it was during COVID, PCEM actually had all this. It could do dynamic images, and it could do parent-child. And then it was orphaned as the main person who was running it. And I'm not going to get all the drama of what happened there. I don't know all the drama of exactly what happened, but it's not this video to talk about that. Now, the project was eventually revived, not before the forums, and a lot of information was lost. But let me ask you, you have the ability, the technical know-how, the time, the stubbornness and tenaciousness and hubris to want to make a project, and you want to get 10,000 some odd games running, and the emulation that you could potentially use to do that isn't quite up to snuff from a speed perspective, but at least it has the technical things you need. It can do parent-child, and it can do dynamic image sizing. But there is a lot of drama related to it. There's people coming and going. You don't know where it's going to be in a year. If I had to guess today, okay, here's the emulator you need. Go make 9x happen. What's the ETA? 3 to 4 years, maybe 5, and that's with help on my server. It's a long process. It's a slow process. What does it take to get a game running in an EXO project? Well, you have to find the disk. We've been working on that. I think we have 9 terabytes worth of Windows 9x data preserved, found. Because while we couldn't emulate it yet, we could go find it, and that's a big thanks to Jimmy at the forums, a fellow named Cairo Saber, Big Jim. These 3 guys, more than them were involved, but those 3 have really led the effort from what I've seen on my end, and I apologize if someone else has been key to the effort and I left you out. Those are the 3 guys I've seen do the most work on that front, and we owe a lot to them, because when 9x comes out, it will be because of their efforts. Every day games disappear. Every day software disappears that was there yesterday and is not there today anymore. It is imperative that somebody is grabbing this stuff and saving it and storing it for someone out there. The companies aren't doing it. They don't care. They'd rather repack it and sell it to you again. And they have every right to do so. I am not knocking that. They can do that. But I would love it if they would take the original copy and put it on there too. And give you both. You know? If I'm going to buy the King's Quest collection on good old games, why not give me King's Quest 1 AGI while you're at it? Is it going to take up too much space? Is that 200 kilobytes going to kill you? No. Why not put the setup file in there so I can change the drivers if I wanted to? Is that extra megabyte going to kill you? And when I say megabyte, I mean over like all 6 games? No. Why not put the original floppy images in there while you're at it? I mean, we're talking about peanuts in the world of how big the files are. I digress yet again. For 9x, I'm not going to put in 4 or 5 years of my life into a project that is using software that I don't know is going to be there in 5 years. If I sink 2 or 3 years of my life into PCEM and it dies and it's dead, I mean, then what do I do? I just have 3 or 4 years of my life built on an emulator that doesn't run anymore, that's not getting updated, and it already wasn't up to snuff. It needed more work, and now it's not going to get that work, so I have to redo everything again? No, doesn't make sense. You don't start building a home until you have the supplies. And Exo9X, that's a lifetime achievement project, man. I've been on Exodos, using DOSBox for 15 years now. That's a long time. Now, I haven't worked on it every day of my life in 15 years. I've worked on Exoscum VM and Exo Win9x, and hell, there are some days I don't work on any of it. I do my own thing. Can you believe it? I have a life. But 9x is literally 3 to 4 years, 5 years of daily work. No progress on Exodos, no progress on Exo Win9x, Exo Scum VM, Exo Apple 2GS, Exo Apple 2E. That's a lot of Exos to say. Sorry. I need a stable emulator. We, as a community, need a stable emulator. It's astounding to me that in 2023, there is not a stable way to play a game that was made for Windows 98, or Windows 95 for that matter. You can do one-offs. You can, Zombiever from Zom's Lair and Biffman, the other guy, they will take games that are Windows 9x games, like, Blade Runner before it got re-released, and they'll pack it into a virtual drive built around that game, and they'll release it with a little installer and everything, and hey, it works. And because of that, it leads people to think that you can do that with every game. But again, I hope that my video has made sense in that, A, if you do that with every game, you have terabytes worth of duplicative OS data because you're packing the same OS over and over and over. And second, I'm not trying to release an installer that sets up the game on your drive. I'm trying to release something that you run a one-time setup. It sets your front end up, and all my batch files are sitting there, and they will call the emulator, which calls the virtual hard drive, which launches, which sets the game off immediately as soon as it comes up. And you are playing the game without navigating Windows 98, without navigating Windows 95, without right-clicking on the desktop and changing the color depth or the resolution or mounting a disk in the menu or whatever, all the little shenanigans you have to do to get a game running. And I'm not saying that you have to do that with the Zombeaver? Zombslayer and Biffman. You don't, they're pretty set up to go, but they're one-offs. If they had to do that with 10,000 games, their methodology would not be viable. So, I have had this discussion every day, not every day, that's an exaggerative, I'm being hyperbolic now. I have had this discussion at least once a month for the past 6, 7, 8 years of my life, where someone shows up and says, hey, you could use VMware, hey, just run it in DOSBox X, hey, PCM runs it fine. But it is always one game, 2 games, 3 games. It's not 10,000 games. It's a very different process to think about what it takes to get a game running and send that to your buddy than it is to preserve thousands of games, make them playable, make them stable, usable for people that do not have a lifetime of knowledge of these systems. Because there will be a day I'm dead, you're dead. Let's get existential for a moment here. There'll be a time when everyone that is alive in the world today is gone. And when that happens, and there's, we're 2, 3 generations down the road, how many people are going to know how to install DOS, run DOS, mess with the DOSBox CONF file, fire up Windows 98? How many people are going to care? There will be people who know how to do it. It will not. I don't think it'll die completely. But if 1,000 people know how to do it in a world that has 10 billion people living in it, what kind of stats is that? Is that preservation? That's elitism. That's the 1%. It's less than 1%. That's the 0.01%. Maybe it's the 0.001%. The fact is, it's not public anymore. It's not available. It is not preservation through playability, usability. I say playability because it's games, but in this case, usability. Just the ability to fire it up and do it. I'm sure there will be a lot of rebuttals and questions to this, so please load up the comments. I will have a second video after I've gotten enough comments to comment on that second video. That was redundant. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I hope, I find myself saying I hope at the end of every video. And that's my sign off now, I guess, is I hope that my explanation is sufficient and that it leads towards an understanding of the scope of what we're talking about here. This isn't about getting your favorite game from 1999 running. It's about getting 10,000 games, and then eventually 20,000 games, and then eventually maybe more. It's about making it so that anyone can download them, anyone can play them, they run properly, and we're not wasting 20 terabytes in the process. Because I said earlier, 2 terabytes, that's just the duplicative OS data. Most games came on CDs by that point. Now, let's say the commercial pack. A majority of that 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 games are going to be CD-based. Some are 2 and 3 CDs long. So now we're talking 500 to 700 megabytes per CD, with some games having more than one. So let's be super generous and say it's 600 megabytes per game. That accounts for the games that didn't come on a CD, being averaged out with the games that came on 3 and 4 CDs. Well, that image has got to be in there of that disk. But then the installed files have to be on the virtual hard drive. So let's say it's half that, 300 megabytes. So 600 plus 300, 900, plus another 200 for the OS, 1,100. You know what 1100 times 10,000 is? Well, if 200 was 2 terabytes, now we're talking 11 terabytes of data for the OS, the game image, and the installed game. There are not a lot of people today that can download an 11 terabyte project. And even if I got this done in 5 years and started right now, in 5 years there will not be a lot of people that can download an 11 terabyte project. Getting that thing down to 6 terabytes, 7 terabytes, that's where we start getting somewhat feasible. My plan would be to release it by year. So 95, 96 would be the first release, the 97, the 98, the 99, 2000. By 2000, 2001, maybe 2001 maybe's in there. 2002 gets pretty iffy. By that time, you have some games that can run in 98, but they're optimized for XP. Anyway, we're talking about a massive project here. It's not small in any way. Not small in scope, not small in size, not small in man hours. So to do it, we have to do it right. Thank you for watching. Talk to you next time.